press conference for Mr. Giorgio today. And today the press conference will be done in English. Before asking the question, please say your name and the media you're from. Okay, should we start now?
First, let me apologize for being late. It's catching a flight.
You want to say a few words first?
No.
Okay, this gentleman, please. No, this, you, yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo. I'm Ben Blanchard. I'm the Reuters bureau chief in Taiwan. You spoke quite a lot in your speech about your military experience in Taiwan, and also about the military relationship between Taiwan and Singapore, which, as you know, is so sensitive, it's never really discussed in public. You obviously now are no longer a Singaporean government official, but you still have a very fascinating insight on the Taiwan-Singapore relationship. Because you're able to talk about these things as a private citizen now, the Project Starlight continues to this day. There are Singaporean troops in Taiwan as we speak, training. Why does this military relationship continue to this day? What benefit is there for both sides, both Singapore and Taiwan, to continue having Singaporean troops training in Taiwan? Thank you.
As I mentioned in the talk, when Singapore first became independent, we had to establish a defense force, and we needed to train our troops. So Taiwan afforded us vast training areas, which were critical in our initial years of independence. Now we train in many more places. It's an old relationship which we treasure and which we're always grateful for.
But is there a reason why it continues to this day? I mean, China surely has often, I know there's military, Singaporean troops have been doing counter-terrorism drills with China recently. I mean, I presume China has offered to Singapore saying, well, don't train your troops in Taiwan, maybe you come and train your troops in China instead.
I think in the late 70s, when Lee Kuan Yew visited China, Hua Feng was the putative leader, and he did ask Singapore not to train in Taiwan, but to train in Hainan. They would have put Singapore in an untenable position.
Yes, please.
The text,
okay, great.
The text of my speech, where I elaborated a little bit more. You can refer to the text of the speech.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo. The idea of a Chinese Commonwealth or a confederation sounds well and all, but is it somewhat wishful thinking that the merge of China and Taiwan be totally non-political? And also, the major issue that forbids two sides to have a healthy dialogue is all about trust. And with Taiwan presidential election coming up, what kind of advice do you have for the candidates to re-establish a channel of communication with China? Thank you.
Oh, I can't be involved in the current political process. In fact, I've taken care to not to be a participant, but to give the views of an outsider who's observed Taiwan for many years, who had this fairly deep relationship with Taiwan, and to express my concern about how disadvantageous the status quo could be for Taiwan if the time that is before us is not fully made use of. Because it is the clock ticking.
Right, but the problem is that we don't have an official dialogue right now. Maybe not for the candidates, but for the general situation, how to reestablish that communication.
So I go back to 2015, when Ma Ying-jeou met Xi Jinping at the highest level, with the greatest respect, and expressing very deep views about a common history and a common future. So that begins the dialogue. And as China said, well, once within a one China framework, which Hu Zhenfu said, and it's for each side to interpret what that means, anything can be discussed, including the idea of a Commonwealth. But there are many other ideas which can be discussed. And even the idea of a Commonwealth itself is so loose, you can explore all kinds of possibilities.
Okay, before next question, I would like to emphasize that we do prepare a test about the speech in even more complete content. Please approach Sonia for the papers if you need it. Yes, this lady, please.
Hello, my name's Mr. Yao. My name's Jane Rickards, and I'm with The Economist. I'm very curious, as you're obviously a long-term observer of the Southeast Asian region and also Australia's relationships with the Southeast Asian region and Taiwan. How do you see the Australian relationship with Taiwan as different from the US? And do you have any comments on how Australia could improve its relationship with, or its management of cross-strait tensions? Thank you.
As an intellectual construct, Australia can either be the 51st state of the US, in which case it just follows everything the US does, or it can be a member of ASEAN, where it huddles close to the region and therefore maintain a monetary position. Australia kind of oscillates between these two limits, and I think under Albanese it's kind of shifted back to a more central position. But when I was a minister, I worked very hard for close relations between Australia and ASEAN, with Singapore taking the lead. And in fact, I'm proud to say, really proud to say, that probably the only Singapore minister to be awarded an AO for Australia. Which I wear with pride, and for which I bring special cards whenever I go down south.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. It's Xu Heqian with Caixin Media, and I'm very glad that you have answered my first part of the question during the speech, that the Singaporeans will be very happy to continually provide the convenience for the potential cross-strait dialogue. But my question will be focused on the next generation leaders and the next generation of the Singaporean diplomats or mainland Taiwan affairs officials, because on the one hand, just as you say, it seems that the younger generation of the Singaporean officials may not have as abundant as the opportunity to engage with the next generation of Taiwanese leaders, political workers. And on the other hand, we have constantly hear some complaints or the frustration from Beijing, especially among the diplomatic communities in Beijing, saying that they are more and more challenging when they're facing more and more challenging environment in mainland China when it comes to engage with the mainland officials or younger generation leaders casually, privately, and with a trustworthy manner. So, what will be if the younger generation of the Singaporean leader come to you for your advice? How would you recommend them for them to equip themselves better for preparing for interacting the future cross-strait dialogue? Thank you.
There's no substitute for effort. And Lee you came here so many times. He must have come to Taiwan every year, and he developed an intimate relationship with Jiang Jingguo. And after Taipei, Li Denghui, as the vice president, would bring him to different parts of Taiwan. He enjoyed Taiwan, but he was always learning and understanding. And I think this, every generation of Singaporeans should try to do. And not just political leaders. I think academics, I think scholars, business people are here, of course. But it's important to know the changes in Taiwan society. It's important for Taiwanese to know the changes in Singapore society. But there is a fairly large Taiwanese community in Singapore, some of whom have gone to Singapore because they are a little worried about Taiwan's future. So it is a very important relationship. It's a thriving relationship, and one we should cherish and treasure.
Okay. Next question? Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, I better stand up. I'm Stephanie Chow with CTI News Network. Thank you. I have a few questions for Mr. Yeo. First of all, I'd like to ask about the U.S.-China relationship, because as you see, the U.S.-China is starting to open more and more dialogues. And actually, I find that the U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer are, pretty harsh on China. We're planning to visit Beijing maybe next month. And my question is, what's the message behind it? And what message delivered to especially Taiwan? As you know, the year 2024 presidential election of Taiwan is fast approaching. What is your speculation about the result? And how would it impact on the U.S.-China relationship and the Indo-Pacific regions? Thank you.
Sorry, which result?
The presidential election.
U.S. presidential elections.
Taiwan.
Oh, Taiwan.
Yes.
We had a question, one after another. Otherwise.
Yeah, U.S.-China relations will define this period of history because it is an emerging power overtaking an existing dominant power. And there's a lot of stress created by this changing relative power position. The U.S. sees China as a threat to its global dominance. I don't think China has such a view of itself, because China is a very homogeneous society. The Chinese people are most comfortable when they're among Chinese people, and they find it easier to govern Chinese people than non-Chinese people. And that's why China is 93% Han. This homogeneity in China is not an accident. It's not the result of one or two policies, but it's very deeply embedded in the culture, in the mentality of the Han people. Whenever there's trouble, shut the gates, throw out the foreigners, keep the Chinese inside. That's the instinct. It's not only during COVID. It's always been in Chinese history, in every dynasty. So this is an aspect of China which the Americans, many Americans don't understand, which many Westerners don't understand. That China has its own nature because it's got a long history, and a very long weakened history, and therefore a very conservative culture which always looks for precedents in the past. Initially, the U.S. feels that, oh, China wants to displace me, wants the renminbi to replace the U.S. dollar, wants to build bases around the world like we have done. I don't think so. But it will take some time for the U.S. to come to that conclusion. In the meantime, there will be a lot of tension. You oscillate between the Cold War and Cold Peace. Hopefully there will be no hot war, but from time to time there could be proxy wars. And Taiwan should be careful not to be involved in it. I would say in the short term, however, there is a lowering of temperature, principally by the U.S. I think for two main reasons. One is in the presidential election, if there's a financial downturn, you need China's cooperation. Remember during the GFC, the G7 was unable to pull the global economy out from a slump. And so George Bush convened the first G20 summit in 2008, and the following year, Gordon Brown in London in 2009, when in response, China put up a 4 trillion renminbi budget. And China played a major role in keeping the global economy afloat after the GFC, for which it distorted its economy. It took years to massage out the distortions. And although it did it also for itself, it got no gratitude from the world. This time the G20 is not like what it was in the past because of the Ukraine war. And there's a crisis, and there's not enough global demand, it will affect US presidential elections, and Trump will come back. So there's a concern in Washington that, look, things are not looking so good, we may need to work with China. Then there's, in addition, the Ukraine war, which is not making the kind of progress NATO had wanted. And there, so much money already been spent. The back pressure of not making progress will in turn affect domestic politics in the US and Europe. And here China may play a mollifying, I won't say peacemaking, but China can help to make things easier to resolve in the future. So I would say the economic concern, the Ukraine war, affecting US presidential elections are what is a reason why in the short term, I believe US-China relations will not get worse, may even get slightly better. As for Taiwan elections, well, we're all watching closely. It's a 4-horse race, maybe it become a 3-horse race. If it's a 2-horse race, then the blue will have an advantage. If it's a 3-horse race or 4-horse race, then the green will have an advantage. But I do not know the situation better than you do. I'm just placing my bets.
Any question? Please.
Hello, Angie from the Digital Media. I have a question. In which context will China accept the concept of Chinese Commonwealth? Because China is so huge, Taiwan is quite little. It's unbalanced. Thank you.
Well, if it's just a matter of Taiwan as a little island, then it's important to China is mostly emotional of Chinese reunification, that Taiwan was taken by force by Japan and should return to China. And this was something which all the victorious powers of the Second World War agreed to. So this Taiwan being a part of China has very strong basis in international law. But it is a civil war which has not ended. So there are two contending jurisdictions, the PRC and ROC. So hopefully the end of that civil war will be a peaceful one where we have a merger of equals, which is why I described Taiwan as the last thing in the two things. You know? They're a very precious one, and it should not be damaged or somehow diminished in the final act of this huge drama of China's, as Liu Xijing's words, re-emergence. So this is something precious, and Taiwan should not just be an island, it should be something which adds to Chinese civilization, which adds to a collective polity, which is something China can learn from, can benefit from. And maintaining that kind of a Taiwan requires there to be hope for the future, so that your best and brightest, your most creative minds will remain in Taiwan and not go to Singapore or the US or somewhere else.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Yao, and I'm Daphne from Economic Daily News. And my question is, some Taiwanese people looking for reunification, maybe based on they have deep emotional connection with China. But just like you said, that Taiwanese society has already changed, especially the younger generation. And some are called 天然独, that they're born to believe Taiwan has already independent. And they were definitely against to the idea of collaborate with China. And taking this into consideration, how to make Chinese Commonwealth become possible? That's the difference between the generation.
So they are against the PRC. They don't want to be part of PRC. They don't want to even be part of the ROC because of certain historical experiences in Taiwan in the past, including 228. So if I were a young Taiwanese, I may have the same feelings. Yeah. But when they say I'm Taiwanese, I'm not Chinese, do you really believe that? What do they speak? What are the CHANG based on? What are the historical references? Of course they know they are Chinese, but they're not PRC. And they may not even want to be ROC, but they are Chinese. And if you look at the long history of Chinese civilization, it's come together, it's broken apart, so it's okay. But it is one civilization and one Chinese people. So if we look further ahead, well, maybe not 10 years, then 100 years, it's still one river flowing into the future. And Taiwanese people are part of it.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Yu, this is Zuri from Zabao. You mentioned in your speech that ASEAN could be a model for the discussion or the formation of a China Commonwealth. But as we all know that all members in ASEAN are sovereign countries, which is not the case that is in the eyes of Beijing for two sides, I mean Taiwan and mainland China. So how can that model of ASEAN work out for the situation of cross-strait?
ASEAN has in fact made remarkable progress. I think the leaders meet 4 times a year, and many developments are initiated at the leaders level. Of course, officials make preparations. There's a small secretariat in Jakarta, which functions as an office for everybody. So it is the leaders, it's leaders-led. association. So this could provide some ideas for Chinese Commonwealth, where the leaders on both sides meet regularly, the way Ma Ying-jeou met Xi Jinping in Singapore, meet regularly, maybe initially once a year, later twice a year. There could be a small office to do coordination. And little by little, when people are relaxed, comfortable, positive, they can find ways to work together. So no one is rushing, but the idea that we are meeting all the time towards a common future in the long term is itself a very positive experience and will create all kinds of possibilities for the future. If we try to define in advance what it should be, you will never get started. But just move in the general direction. That's my hope anyway.
Yes, please.
I'm Zhang Junkai from HK01. I have two questions. First, Hong Kong, yes. First one is, do you agree the 2024 Taiwan election is a choice between war and peace? The second one is, most people in Taiwan do not want to reunification. But if reunification cannot be avoided, do you think how should Taiwanese people adapt to this dilemma? Thank you.
No leader in Taiwan can go further than what the US allows Taiwan to go in the direction of Taiwan independence. So the US sets limits on what any Taiwanese leader can do. The question is, should Taiwan allow itself to be used by the US, to be played on the US chessboard? If the US puts pressure, then Taiwan may have to go along to a point. But if Taiwan volunteers to be used by the US, that may gain Taiwan short-term advantages, but when it suits the US, Taiwan may be cast aside. So if I were Taiwanese, I do not want to be used. I want to use the US, but I do not want to be used. But when you try to use a big power, it's very dangerous. So it's better to have clear, simple positions which you stick on to, and don't be opportunistic or being too clever or tactical. Because in the end, you try to make use of big power, the big power will in turn control you. And Taiwan should try not to be in that position.
Okay, due to time limits, we're going to have only 2 more questions. Any more? I have one who hasn't asked yet. No? All right, please.
Hi, I'm from Central News Agency in Taiwan. Just to follow up the used question, when you say Taiwan should not allow itself to be used, what do you mean by it? Like, can you elaborate on being used? In what way? And the second question is more a casual one. So you always describe Singapore as a family, not family member, but relative of this Chinese family. If one day Chinese Commonwealth gets established, would Singapore be willing to join this Commonwealth? Thank you.
So it must not be, say Nancy Pelosi's visit. I understand that the government here was not really keen on the visit, but they could not say no. And if we kind of do a forensic analysis, do a post-mortem on that visit, Taiwan was being used. And it resulted in Taiwan becoming more constrained than before the visit. So China had to disincentivize such actions. And it's at the cost of the Taiwanese people. And it's also not good for China. So if Kevin McCarthy did not come, instead, well, the meeting was in the US. And Lai Ching-te's recent visit was carefully calibrated so as not to be provocative. China had to react, but China also calibrated its response. That's what I mean by not being used. Have your own position and determine your own limits, and don't go beyond that. Otherwise, when it's at the time that you least want, you end up being in the position that you don't want to be. As to whether Singapore should join the larger Chinese Commonwealth, only in the cultural, maybe economic sense, but never the political sense. Because the Chinese in Southeast Asia, while they're very dominant in the economy, they're a minority. And in many Southeast Asian countries, there's an anti-Chinese feeling. So one Thai king described the Chinese in Southeast Asia as a Jewish problem. I think it was Mongkut or Chura, I can't remember. So we have to be very sensitive in Singapore about how we are perceived by other countries in ASEAN. And we are multiracial. So Singapore has to affirm that very strongly and cannot afford any political association in a Chinese Commonwealth. But if it's cultural, it's about Tai Chi, if it's about economy, that's fine.
Okay, now we had a last question from someone who hasn't asked the question. Anyone? Then we from someone who has already asked the question. Okay.
Sorry, just briefly.
Yes.
And one of the big differences between Taiwan and China is democracy, frankly. I mean, the Taiwanese have looked at what's happened in Hong Kong and been completely horrified. They've looked at what's happened in Xinjiang, people being interned and have been horrified. Tibet, 1989, all of this stuff. Like, Taiwan has gone from being a very brutal dictatorship into being a very, very open, modern, vibrant economy. Democracy. China has gone backwards under Xi Jinping. You know, how should, is there any way to bridge this gap? I mean, to try and encourage Taiwanese that perhaps maybe your democracy isn't so important and you'll be better off with Xi Jinping?
Well, if I were Taiwanese, the last thing I want to do is to try and influence China's domestic development, because that's a prescription for trouble. The Portuguese understood that during Macau. Hong Kong people were under a delusion that they could influence the mainland. That's a mistake. The mainland has its own internal dynamic. It will rise and fall according to its own internal dynamic. You can criticize it, you can recognize its good points, but that's China. What Taiwan should want is, please recognize that I'm different from you. I have a separate history. I like my democracy, warts and all, and like to maintain my way of life, our healthcare system, our environment, and please respect that. I think China will respect that. But if China wants respect for Taiwanese identity, it must respect the mainland identity and not lightly comment on or criticize China for its policy in Xinjiang or Tibet or whatever. So that's the beginning of conversation. I respect you for who you are, you respect me for what we are, then we can talk. Now, Taiwan, however, can influence China in a soft way. So when they see Tzu Chi, when they see TSMC, we wonder, how is it little Taiwan can do such remarkable things? So Pope Francis, whom I had the honor of working for 7 years, he said, you do not evangelize by preaching, by criticizing. You evangelize by being attractive, by your own behavior. So if Taiwan shows that it is a nice society that is well run, and people like to visit, and they go back with certain ideas, that is the best way to influence China. Not by criticizing China and telling China what is good for you and what's not good for you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we must end our press conference, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
所以你去背是在哪儿？ 原来好的益生菌真的可以帮助入睡。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌是国家认证 AB 克菲尔益生菌，含7种有身份证的专利活菌，能产生伽巴、色氨酸等助眠因子，难怪吃了更快入睡，也睡得更好。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌也是台湾市场上唯一添加克菲尔乳杆菌 M1 的产品。这是由台湾知名的大学季转，对季节敏感、调整体质的朋友，真的是一大福音。还有这支还添加被称为超级食物的羽衣甘蓝萃取物，不少研究都指出，十字花科蔬菜有助抗炎及防癌，像是羽衣甘蓝含有高量的叶黄素、贝塔胡萝卜素、维生素 K、维生素 C、叶酸等丰富营养素。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌专利制成，无塑化剂、无重金属、无人工添加物、无410项农药、无香料调味剂、无防腐剂、无色素，7大保证、7大认证，觉得好安心。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Feel Good， 快点购下单！太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌。